Well, good morning. Welcome to Sunday School here at Macedonia Baptist Church. We are very glad that you've joined us for this morning as we continue our study through the book of Esther. And as we start in Esther chapter 5 this morning, as we get into chapter 5, you're going to see something. The whole story of Esther slows way down. I mean, it just slows way down. It's like comes to a crawl. What you got is a step-by-step description of a 24-hour day. Chapter 5 all the way through chapter 6, about verse 3, maybe verse 4, is one day. You have one 24-hour day, and you have a step-by-step description of that 24-hour day. Now, Esther is facing a desperate situation in her life. She is at a desperate moment in her life. If we remember last time we was together, Mordecai had told Esther to go and plead for the Jews. Go before the king and plead before the Jews, which Esther knew the law. You just couldn't walk into the king without being summoned. If you walked in, that could mean death. So she begins to make excuses. And finally, Mordecai says, no, no, no. And then you see the courage of this young teenage girl, Esther. Most people say she's a teenager. At the oldest, she's probably in her 20s. But you just see the courage of this young woman. But this is a desperate situation in her life. And a lot of times when we get in desperate moments in our life, a lot of times we try our best to get out of them as quick as we can. We are a hurry-up society. We stream, we want satisfaction right now at this moment. You know, we're the microwave popcorn generation. We don't want to wait 2 minutes. We want it now. If our phones are buffering, we go crazy. We go to the next thing. So we are a want it now people. But a lot of times in desperate moments in our life, we need to wait on God's timing. Because God's timing is perfect. Now, here's the problem. We want it on our timing. We don't want to wait on God. But if there's anything Esther chapter 5 will show us is this. In our desperate moments, we need to wait on God. We need to wait on His direction. Now, what you have here is Esther. She has said, okay, Mordecai, let's do this. I'll go to the king. If I die, I die. If I die, I die. I will do this. She is facing a desperate situation. But not only that, I want you to think about something for a minute. If you had a deep, dark secret that you had to tell your spouse, something that you kept hidden from them for all the time you were dating, and the years that you've been married, and you finally wanted to come clean with this deep, dark secret that you've kept from them, how do you think they would react? Well, that's exactly what Esther's fixing to do. Esther hasn't yet told the king she's a Jew. She has kept this fact hidden from the king. So here she is. She is fixing to have to go and tell the king and plead to him for her people and come clean about, I've kept this secret from you, honey. I'm a Jew. Don't you know that she would sit there and run through her head, how's he going to react? Is he going to go through and kill everybody that helped keep this secret? Is he going to kill me for even just being in the room? Is he going to just get rid of me like he did Vashti? He's done this before. He's got rid of Vashti. This is a desperate moment, a fearful situation in her life. How's my husband going to react when I tell him this secret? Not only the fact that I'm going in to the throne room without being summoned, but I'm also got to tell him this secret that I'm a Jew. So she is in a desperate situation. Now listen, Esther was an obedient woman. She was obedient. She was obedient to Mordecai. We've seen that in Scripture in chapter 2. She was obedient to Haggai, the eunuch that helped her. She was obedient to the king. She's been obedient to the law. She even tells Mordecai the law. I can't go just walk into the king without being summoned. It means that I could die. She was very obedient up to this point. She's going to break the law right here in chapter 5. She's going to go to the king without being summoned. So what you have here is you have this woman in a desperate moment in her life. In a desperate moment in her life, what does she do? Well, she does exactly what we ought to do. She acts by faith. She acts by faith and she waits on God. You say, well, wait a minute. She didn't wait on God. She went the next morning to the king. Well, what I'm going to show you in chapter 5 is this, is she waited on God. Now, chapter 5, verse 1 says this, Now it happened on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in front of the inner court of the king's palace across from the king's house, while the king sat in the royal throne in the royal house facing the entrance to the house. Now what you have here, Esther gets up the next day. She takes off after 3 days of mourning and praying. I believe praying, because you don't separate fasting and prayer in the Bible. You just don't do it. I believe she prayed. But you have all this. You have all this. She takes all this, cleans up, puts on her royal robes after these 3 days, and she goes and she stands. She dresses in her royal garments with the probably long trains and veil and dressed like a queen, and she goes and she stood in the inner court of the king's palace. Now, one thing that I've got to show you in verse 1 is just fascinating. 6 times in verse 1, you see royalty. I mean, look right here. You've got her royal robes, stood in the inner court, king's palace, across from the king's house. While in the house they facing, look, the king sat, royal throne, royal house. You have all. Why is all this in here? This shows you how intimidating the situation Esther was in. Esther was in a very intimidating situation. She is in the presence of royalty. She's in the presence of power. She is in a very, very, very intimidating situation. Now, she most likely would have not been here many times. She would not have been here. She would have been, Esther would have stayed in her part of the palace, in the queen's palace, kind of sequestered there. She would not have been in this room many, many, many times at all. And I can tell you this right now. I really think her faith has been activated. I think it was activated on the 3 days of fasting and prayer. Not only does she go from making excuses, but she says, if I die, I die. She comes in this fearful situation. Listen, this could have meant death. In fact, I truly believe that she believed she was going to die. I truly believe that, because, I mean, she knew the law. So what you have here is she's standing in the inner court. Now, this would be a long room full of pillars. And you would have Esther over here, and the king would be on his throne on the opposite ends. They would be facing each other. So what you have here is, as Esther stood, you have the king sitting. Where the king would have a bunch of axes, people with axes around him, ready to chop off the head and kill the people that came in unannounced, he would also have the golden scepter. This is a very tense moment. See, what you have here is Esther at the inner court. She is either waiting to see if the king will reject her or receive her. So you have, if this was a movie, you would have the climactic music. You would have the music here. What's going to happen? What's going to happen? Is he going to reject her? Is he going to see her? What's going to happen? She's standing there at the opposite end. Verse 2. So it was when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, that she found favor in his sight, that the king held out in his hand the golden scepter. Then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter. Now, let me tell you something. He lifts his head. He looks down that long room and he sees his queen. He sees Esther. He sees his wife, who he hadn't seen, by the way, in 30 days. We found that out last week, last time in chapter 4. He sees his queen. He sees Esther. And the Bible says in chapter 5, verse 2, that she found favor in his sight. He found favor. She didn't have to seek it out. That the king did not have to figure out whether he wanted to kill her or not. When the king saw her, he didn't have to work favor up. He didn't have to hunt it up. He didn't have to drum it up. He didn't have to work. He immediately found favor when he saw her. He immediately found her. And he extends the golden scepter to her to assure her safety. Well, she touches it. She touches it. Verse 3. And the king said to her, "What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given up to you up to half the kingdom." Now this is where you're going to see God's timing. In this desperate moment, you're going to see God's timing. The king, look, there's no doubt in my mind the king probably knew Esther was troubled. Number one, she is in the inner court, which she just don't go in. So something's going on. And I could say he could tell by the look in her face that she was troubled, scared, frightened, whatever you want to describe it. And he comes and he basically encourages her to talk. If this was us, we would say, "What's going on, baby? Hey, honey, tell me what you want. Baby, tell me what you need, honey. Tell me what." He encourages to talk here. In fact, look what he says. He comes and he says this. He says, "What is your request? It shall be given to you up to half the kingdom." Now look, he is not going to give her half the kingdom. That's a saying. That would be me like telling Wendy, "Hey, baby, I'll get you anything you want. Anything you want, I'll give it to you. Whatever you need, I'll give it to you." That's what he's doing here. Do you see? It's like he's saying, "Hey, baby, what do you want? I see your trouble. You don't have to be scared. I'll give you whatever you want, honey." That's the way it seems. He's sitting there and he's talking to her. Now look, Esther, who has been fearing for her life, has now been promised that she could have whatever she wanted. So what does she do? Look in verse 4. So Esther answered, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him." So she comes and she asks the king and Haman, "Hey, look, I want you to come to this banquet. I'm going to throw a banquet, and I want you to come." Well, here's something that we're looking at in verse 4, and I have looked and I have studied and I have read, and you can find anything and everything about this. But look at verse 4. She said, "I have prepared, I want you to come to the banquet I have prepared for him." Who's the him? Is it Haman or is it the king? Read the verse again. "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him." Who's the him? Is it Haman or is it the king? Now I'm just going to tell you, when you read and study this, you get both sides of the fence. Well, she prepared it for Haman because she's fixing to tell the king about what Haman's done. Or you say, "Oh, she's prepared this for the king because that's her husband." You see both sides of the argument. Here's the truth of the matter. Nobody really knows. Nobody knows. But verse 4, she tells him, "Look, honey, you come to this banquet. You come to this banquet that I prepared." So look what happens in verse 5. "Then the king said, 'Bring Haman quickly, that they may do as Esther has said.' So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared." Now look, I just got to tell you. It almost seems to me, if I could get Wendy on camera and do this, I would say, she's got me wrapped around her little finger. It is almost like the king is wrapped around Esther's little finger. Think about this. She enters the inner court without being summoned, and he and haven't seen him in a month, and she finds favor. Not only that, he says, hey, baby, hey, sweetheart, hey, darling, what do you need? What's going on? Tell me what's happening. I'll give you anything you want. And she says, all I want is for you, honey, to come to a banquet. Come to a banquet that I've prepared for you and your buddy Haman. And look what he says. Get me Haman here now, right now. You bring him here now. You do what Esther says. Does it not seem like she's got him right here? Well, then Esther, at the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, what is your petition? Verse 6, it shall be granted you. What is your request? Up to half the kingdom, it shall be done. For the second time, they're at this banquet. For the second time, the king says, baby, what do you need? Honey, what do you want? It will not be denied you. I'll give you whatever you want. I'll give you up to half the kingdom. I will give you whatever you need. Just ask. That's twice the king has done this. That's twice the king. Now look, I'm just going to tell you, and I'm sure a lot of you have been this way. How many times have you been in a car with your spouse and you say, honey, let's go out to eat. I'll take you anywhere you want to go, baby. Anywhere you want to go. I don't care. It don't matter. And then you sit there and go, well, what do you want? I don't care. It don't matter. And you say, well, how about it? It don't care. It don't matter. And you just say, look, I'm going to make a restaurant of I don't care and it don't matter, and I'll become a millionaire. But it's just, here's the king, and he's asked her twice, honey, tell me what's wrong. Tell me what's wrong. Tell me what you want. Tell me what you need, and it's going to be done. It'll be taken care of. Twice he tells her that. And I truly believe when you get to verse 7, something happens.